Hello, and welcome to another episode of Unworthy History. Today we got some actual history for you from this book right here, Rip Ford's Texas, written by John Salmon, otherwise known as Rip Ford. So today this story is called My Fighting Stock. It's some stories about his ancestry and their battles with the English during the Revolutionary War. The Fords came to the New World at a rather early date. They settled in Virginia, New Jersey, and Maryland, if the reports be true. John Ford, the writer's grandfather, immigrated to South Carolina from Virginia during the days of British rule. He was a major in the service of the United States during the Revolutionary War. He was in many battles and escaped without any serious hurt. At the siege of Savannah, Georgia, by the Americans under General Benjamin Lincoln, he was much exposed. Ford visited home shortly afterward, and his wife said he had more than 20 bullet holes in his clothing. Some balls had grazed and discolored the skin, but not one had entered his flesh. The French and Americans assaulted the British works on October 9, 1779, and were repulsed. The French loss was 600, the Americans lost 400. At the Battle of Camden on August 16, 1780, John Ford is said to have made many narrow escapes. George Salmon, the father of the writer's mother, was attached to the commissary department during the Revolutionary War. He had the smallpox in 1780 and was sent out of camp. On his return to camp, he was captured by the British and was in Major Patrick Ferguson's camp on Kings Mountain when the Americans attacked it on October 7, 1780. Salmon described the battle very vividly. When the fire became hot, the British soldiers sought shelter wherever they could. So many got behind the wagons that they overturned them. He said wagons had wooden covers in those days. The firing had grown terrific. Confusion prevailed generally. He approached the officer in charge of the guard and asked, "Am I to stand here and be killed by my own people?" The officer replied, adding an oath, "Every man must take care of himself now." Salmon ran down the mountain. The first man he met was an American captain, an old acquaintance. His salutation was, "My God, Salmon, have you turned Tory?" "No, I am just escaping from the British," was the reply. George Salmon's wife, Elizabeth Young, was then a young girl of about 16 years of age. She was staying with an uncle at the time. The British came and encamped on the plantation. The ladies retired into a room and closed the door. Major Ferguson occupied a room across a hall. "He came to our door," Elizabeth Young recalled, and said, "Ladies, you may open your door. I am a gentleman, and I will see you are not molested." We opened the door. The major came in and was seated. He entered into conversation and asked me, "My daughter, where is your uncle?" "In the Whigs' camp, sir." "If he had as much sense as you have, he would not be there, would he?" "I think he would, sir." He then began telling us that he was in the habit of fooling the rebels, that in action he wore a short coat and acted with a sword in his left hand. "They have wounded me 11 times, but can't kill me." I was told that it was the method our officers adopted to distinguish them from the enemy while in battle. Soon after the British left, an American scouting party came along. They were informed of the boast of Major Ferguson. I was told that our troops made it a point to fire at the British officer carrying his sword in his left hand. The major's ruse failed that time. He was killed, almost his whole army killed or captured. 1,198 constituted the British loss. The American loss was only 88. Major John Ford had his plantation and house robbed by a band of Tories. They carried off the clothing of an infant child. One of his neighbors, whose name will not be repeated, headed the infamous expedition. Ford swore vengeance. He obtained a furlough, learned the Tory was at his house, armed himself, and was in the Tory's room before he took the alarm. The leader of robbers was taking his supper with his gun across his lap. It was now useless. An attempt to raise it would have invited instant death. Ford told him of his crime, perpetrated upon innocent women and children, and that he had come to kill him. Ford struck him on the head with his sword. The Tory's wife was aroused. She screamed and begged so piteously for her husband's life that Ford relented, telling the cowardly thief he could go. In 1781 or 1782, the Indians and Tories made a descent upon the country adjacent to the Greenville courthouse in South Carolina. They killed the writer's great-grandmother by the father's side. They were very old. Their cold-blooded slayers placed the muzzles of their guns against their heads and blew their brains out. The holes were reported to have been as large as one's fist. A Tory named Bates, a leader in these sanguinary operations, went to the house of a gentleman named Motlow and murdered his wife and children, Motlow not being at home. The Tories afterwards managed to capture him. He was undaunted and ready to meet the fate seemingly in store for him. Bates began plundering his person. He was stooping down, taking the buckles of his prisoner's shoes. Motlow said, "Bates, can't you wait until after you have killed me before you rob me?" Just at that moment a gun was fired. The ball passed through Motlow's body. He fell upon Bates. The latter raised himself up and placed Motlow on his feet again. Motlow ran and was pursued some distance. The blood was gushing from his wounds. He held his arms over his breast and endeavored to staunch the flow. He reached a precipice on a stream, made a leap, alighted unhurt, and escaped. His bloodthirsty pursuers did not dare to make the effort he had. They halted. Motlow recovered from his wound. Some years after the close of the war, a man was put in jail at Greenville Courthouse for horse stealing. Someone told Motlow the description suited that of Bates. Motlow armed himself, went to the jail, demanded the keys, and obtained them. Finding the prisoner to be Bates, Motlow carried him out into the public square and shot him. Such was the infamous reputation of Bates, the red-handed assassin, and such the state of feeling in the community that no one dared to interfere with Motlow while enacting the tragedy or to call him to account for it. They felt that a just retribution had overtaken a bloody fiend. It was during one of these raids of Indians and Tories that my grandfather, George Salmon, piloted a party of men to a store which the Indians had robbed. They were on a big spree and could have been whipped easily. The men did not wish to attack. While Salmon was endeavoring to persuade them to fight, an Indian shot him through the body. He said that to cleanse the wound, a silk handkerchief was passed through it from side to side several times. He lived to do good service afterwards. The reader will say, "What do you mean by introducing these old things?" Simply this: when one comes of fighting stock, he has a right to be proud of it. So that's the end of this episode. This is the first episode in a series that I'll do on Rip Ford. This is about his fighting stock, as he calls it, or his ancestors who fought during the Revolutionary War. So if you want to hear more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.